Hi, Year 13. This lecture is just looking at the methods in context part of the paper. So this would be the question that you'll have to link your evaluation of the method directly to an item and a research context given to you in the paper. You will need to use the worksheet that I gave you on Monday this week to try and assess what research issues are there when investigating the following different contexts in crime, okay? So the questions you might get should and probably will be in one of these different contexts. So if you're used to evaluating research in these areas, you should be absolutely fine. So domestic violence and other types of violent crimes, corporate crime, offenders by age, gender, ethnicity and class should be there, victims of crime, the criminal justice system, such as the police, courts and prisons, investigating the mass media, and suicide. So, for example, when you're thinking about victims, like who are they? Are they aware they're victims? Can you get access to particular victims of particular types of crime? And how do they respond to being victims? And is it different for different social groups? On the next, this is what the sheet should look like, okay? And what I'll do is I'll attach it to the email for this lecture as well, okay? So this is the one I'm hoping you'll complete in this lecture. So as we go through, please can you have a think about which of these methods would be most suited for each context or not, okay? So which ones would be totally unsuitable. So there's experiments, both lab and field. You've got questionnaires. We're very open questionnaires or closed questionnaires. Remember, you've got different types of questionnaires in the sense you have like postal or emailed questionnaires, and then you have the very formalised questionnaires where you would read the questions to the respondent, which is pretty much a structured interview. Interviews, structured and unstructured. So the British Crime Survey, for example, is a questionnaire that you interview people with. So therefore, it's also a structured interview and unstructured. You've got observation, you've got participant and non-participant, as well as covert, which is when they don't know they're being studied, and overt, when they do know. You've got documents, historical documents, contemporary documents, like sources of media, personal documents, and don't forget official documents as well, things like court reports and police reports. Not to forget official statistics, okay, and unofficial statistics, which should be collected by agencies that are not government agencies. So what we look at is domestic violence, okay. What do you know about investigating domestic violence? What issues can you think about when investigating domestic violence? And which methods would be appropriate and which ones might not work? So you've got to remember that domestic violence happens in private. It's not something that's easy to observe, for example. And there's normally only the perpetrator and the victim who are witnesses. So how are you going to gain access to the information about domestic violence? Are you going to go to the police and find out how many get reported to the police? You could possibly go to ER wards, emergency wards, and find out how many women or men get admitted with injuries that seem to be like domestic violence cases. You can questionnaires, interviews, but again, how do you get access to these people? And one place you might want to consider going to are women's refuges, where they take in women who have been victims of domestic abuse, and they're entirely female places. So that might be a place where respondents feel quite safe to be part of your research. When it comes to other violent crimes, you might want to consider, who are the perpetrators, okay? Who are the perpetrators of different types of violent crimes? The question will probably normally give you that. If it's not clear, maybe you might want to clarify, for some types of violent crime, men are much more likely to be the perpetrators, and maybe different ethnic groups as well. The problem with studying violent crimes is that, again, they're difficult to observe because they are unexpected, they probably would take place in public. For example, young males fighting on a Friday or Saturday night out, but you can't guarantee that's going to happen. Difficult to obtain a sample, okay, both of perpetrators and possibly victims. You've got the ethical issues, things like guilty knowledge. So if you are conducting research on violent gangs and you are working with them, if you observe them beating someone up, you've got knowledge of a crime that legally you have a duty to report to the police. However, that can put you in danger if they believe that you might possibly go to the police. That might put you personally at risk. And also then there's the danger of the people in your study getting arrested because of your research, and that's unethical in itself. You've also got the problem with validity, depending on what methods you use. So if you're interviewing or possibly asking questions, men or boys might want to exaggerate their extent of involvement in violent crime to make them look hard. Or you might have victims who want to deny them being victims of violent crime. They might try and underplay how affected they were of it. And that this process, what they call the neutralisation of harm caused, when they try and justify it and think that it wasn't actually that serious. Corporate crime is another question you might get asked about. By its nature, it has very low visibility, so it's really difficult to observe it actually happening, and very unlikely to be reported. Now, it's unlikely to be reported because there's a diffusion of victimization. People don't feel like they've been assaulted like they would in like a street crime. Most people are unaware that they're victims of white-collar crime, whether it's embezzling money or insider trading or tax avoidance. These are all types of white-collar corporate-level crimes, okay? One thing that's worth considering are the practical issues of access. Unlike street crime, where you might think, well, lots of crime happens in this area, I'll just sit here and see what happens. Very difficult to get access to offices, to conference rooms, to actually witness the process of a corporate crime happening. Okay? Your most likely candidates for information would be what they call whistleblowers, people who work in the industry but find out or want to report that actually something very unethical and illegal is going on. However, many of these whistleblowers have lost their jobs, so you've got to think about the ethical sides of them being involved in your research. You'll probably you could get a question about offenders, and you've got to consider which offenders are more likely. So it might be about gender. Well, we know that men and boys appear in statistics much more often, but then again, we also know that these statistics aren't entirely true. So why might men be overrepresented in official crime statistics? It's something to do with the chivalry theory. But women are becoming more involved in crimes. Can you remember what types of crimes are women becoming more involved in? This could link in for Adler's theory. And there are increasing numbers of all-girl gangs now, where to gain access, girls will sometimes have to have sex with a large number of men. And then their roles are slowly changing within gangs. As I said to you, they're becoming like the intelligent members of the gang, not involved in the violence, but very much responsible for controlling communications. So, girls' involvement in gangs is increasing. It's also worth mentioning that there is an increase in domestic violence against men, where the perpetrators have been women. Ethnicity, or Afro-Caribbean, very much more likely to appear in statistics for street crime. However, when it comes to white-collar crime, predominantly the perpetrators are white. It's also much less visible. The reason white people are much more likely to commit white-collar crime is because black and Asian people don't tend to get as promoted as many of the white people because of discrimination within the industry. So they sort of come up against their own sort of glass ceiling of discrimination against ethnic minorities within the workplace, so they're less likely to gain access to those positions where they could commit a white-collar crime. When it comes to age, when it comes to violent crime, street crime, it's very much young people who are much more likely to be both the perpetrators and the victims of violent crime. However, when you look at much more organised crime and white-collar crime, the age starts to go up to like middle-aged or older, depending on the nature of the exact crime. And sorry, this is covered up by the circle, but state crimes are generally committed by white, middle-class men. Okay. So what methods would work for each group and which methods might not work for each group? So when it comes to victims of crime, you've got to consider that many victims can either be hidden from sight or may be extremely vulnerable, particularly children or disabled people, or very ill people who might not be able to communicate exactly what's going on around them. There are also low report rates for certain crimes. So can you think of any examples of crimes that are very much underreported and why that might be? Worth mentioning that victims of corporate, white-collar crime and state crime are very difficult to find. They either might not realise they're a victim or they might not be allowed to speak about what's happened to them. When it comes to researching victims, you've got to be very much aware of the psychological harm you may cause them by asking them to recall or quantify their experiences as a victim. And for many victims, because you probably won't be there when it happens to them, you'll be asking them to, whatever method you're using, you'll be asking them to recall something that happened to them. So you've got to take into account problems of validity and the accuracy of their memory. They may over-exaggerate or, again, underplay the severity of the crime they were a victim of. The British Crime Survey asks victims to reflect on the past year and their experiences as victims. So that's one criticism of the British Crime Survey, that it relies on memory. The criminal justice system is an enormously closed system, okay? Very difficult issues of access. For example, you would need permission to conduct research, open research anyway, of the police force, of the magistrates, of the judges, and definitely the prisons, okay? Unless you perhaps use the public bench, okay, and observe in courts, for example, as a witness to a case, then you don't have to declare that you're doing any research. Depending on your research topic, okay, will affect whether you get permission to do the research. Particularly getting governmental permission to maybe investigate, racism within the police force, okay? The only reason the Macpherson report got so much power to investigate racism in the police force was because the media was demanding an investigation because there was so much outrage as to how the police dealt with the Stephen Lawrence case. Okay, so it's actually quite tough to investigate aspects of the criminal justice system. It's generally quite closed. It is worth mentioning when it comes to the validity, if you've got a power difference between the respondents and the researcher, this can affect the validity of the research. So if I was a sociologist investigating prisoners and their experiences of being in prison, then I would be considered the more powerful person in that, and that might affect their responses. However, if I was going to research judges, for example, and senior judges, they would be more powerful than me. So that might affect their responses, or it might affect my interpretation of their responses. Within the criminal justice system, is it actually possible to go undercover? So is the covert participant observation method even realistic? Well, in some cases, yes. There are examples of research where sociologists have gone undercover with the police force, or they've just gone out in case, they've pretended to be journalists when actually they've been doing sociological research. Might want to consider Chambliss going out with the RDU in Washington. And it is worth thinking that within the criminal justice system, you might be studying some of the most vulnerable groups and their victims, as well as criminals and their experiences in the criminal justice system. Now, Becker would argue that you need to side on the side of the underdog here, so possibly the prisoners who are in prison and have absolutely no control or no voice. Suicide. Sorry, the slide's been cut off, so I'm going to have to talk you through this. A very contemporary issue in sociology. What you've got to remember, practically, access to victims is limited because they die, apart from para-suicides, which is what Taylor was very interested in studying. Getting access to official reports and documents from the courts, from the police, is also limited, and you need to get permissions from official bodies. Access to personal documents such as suicide notes and diaries. You need family permission. You've got to think about the ethical issues of asking your family to share that sort of material because they might just want to forget about it. For all of these, however, you'll be looking at documents and they'll be secondary. So they're not produced for your research. And some concepts may have different meanings to the ones that you are trying to investigate. So if someone talks about being brokenhearted in a love letter, that might be very different to someone else's experiences of being brokenhearted in another letter. How do you figure out which person was more or less brokenhearted? There are 4 or 5 key studies when you want to consider suicide who use slightly different methods. You've got Durkheim, who's a positivist and analysed official statistics from several European countries. Only Europe, so therefore can be criticised for being Eurocentric. You've also got Douglas's study, argued that suicide statistics were socially constructed. Douglas did categorise suicide into 4 different types, and he said that suicide means different things to the different victims of suicide. Then you've got Atkinson's research, and he was just interested in observing the social construction process within the courts, so observing coroners' courts. And he said you could never find out the causes of suicide. And this has been cut off here, so I'm sorry about that. You've got Taylor's study, and he studied para-suicides, okay? He was very interested in doing case studies of people who tried to commit suicide or did successfully commit suicide on the London Underground. So for him, it was interviews, it was documents, it was looking through the official court reports and police reports, okay? What was interesting about Taylor's research is he actually found out that his causes of suicide were very similar to the categories that Durkheim came up with, things like anomie and feeling lonely, for example. Finally, Jerry Jacobs is the other one I really want you guys to remember because he did a qualitative analysis of 112 suicide notes to determine why people committed suicide, and really he argued he gained real Verstehen as he was able to truly understand why people commit suicide. Methods and context questions are all 15 marks, and you should take about 20 minutes answering them. They consist of 3 ingredients. Referring to the item is key, evaluating the method, and identifying the issues and researching that particular topic in that context, all right? You will not get into level 3, the top band, unless you apply your knowledge directly to the topic in the question, okay? So it's really, really important that you do this. Here are how the responses are levelled, okay? So you're all aiming for level 3, 12 to 15. Response covers the method with specific application to the issue. If you do a general answer, just evaluating the use of, unstructured interviews when investigating crime generally, you can only get the level 2 mark, okay? So here's an example of a paragraph, which annoyingly the bottom has been cut off, okay? Can you just have a quick look at this paragraph, okay? This is a level 1 or 2 paragraph, okay? It does talk about violence, okay? But it doesn't talk specifically about domestic violence, okay? And it's a very generalised paragraph. It's very much more evaluating the method as opposed to evaluating the method linked to the context of domestic violence, okay? At the very bottom here, it says which is when the responses are influenced by the researcher's presence. So if you can compare the previous paragraph to this paragraph, and you can see how this paragraph is definitely a level 3 paragraph because it clearly links to evaluating unstructured interviews in the context of domestic violence. Okay, so I'll read through it with you. Unstructured interviews are a qualitative research method favoured by interpretivists. They would argue that it is a very useful method as it allows the researcher to paint a valid picture of the experiences of domestic violence of the participant. On the other hand, positivists would argue that unstructured interviews make it difficult to compare and contrast and establish patterns. Also, because of the sensitive nature of domestic violence, the participant may react to interviewer bias and either under or over-exaggerate the true extent of domestic violence in their home, as they are concerned about what the researcher thinks of them. So, this is a really good paragraph because it's included the theoretical debate as well as looking at some of the validity issues as well. So try and, when you practice methods and context questions, make sure you're constantly using the language of the question to make sure your essay is focused on the question. Top tip, use the item. Identify the pluses and minuses, the positives and negatives in the item, and use them, okay? And I would try, you can probably write about 2 or 3 paragraphs just on the problems and the strengths and weaknesses identified in the item, okay? It's also, when evaluating a method, useful to push it up against another method. So if you do say unstructured interviews are not very practical, you need to compare it to another method. Say they are not very practical when compared to questionnaires. As questionnaires take hardly any time. Okay, again, you must link it to the research context. Okay. Look for the general research characteristics involved in the topic, okay? So when you see the topic, you should think, oh, hang on, I know about some of the issues in investigating this area, and get them down into your essay. Finally, do use the pervert criteria, but don't do a point on every single one of them. That is not necessary. What's a good focus is what I call PET, P-E-T. Practical issues, ethical issues, and theoretical issues, particularly the tension between a bit of research being really ethical, okay? However, it might not necessarily be the most valid from the interpretivist point of view. Try and recognise the tension between practical, ethical, and theoretical issues, okay? A very good place to start. I would always write my first point on the theoretical issues. So here's a quick plan that you might use. So is the method a positivist or interpretivist method, and why? Again, try and link to the topic. Are there any general problems in research in this area or topic? So gaining access, for example, and then go into the evaluation of the method linked to that topic, okay? So there you go. That gives you your introduction, because I know some of you are quite worried about introductions. Just write about the theoretical debate in the introduction and then go into the rest of your plan. And in your conclusion, you might want to suggest another method that might be more sensible, or the process of triangulation or methodological pluralism when you use more than one method to make up for the weaknesses in your initial method. So if I was going to do questionnaires, which are objective and representative but lack validity, I might also do unstructured interviews on a smaller sample to check that my findings in my questionnaire are actually accurate, which is triangulation. Thanks, Year 13. Good luck with this.